Hi everyone, and welcome to the hottest ever growth show. One big question. I'm very thankful to have my expert panel of Tom Pickering and David Berkeley with us today. We are going to be looking at skill sets and the capability to change and identifying skill sets in a business. There's so much change going on in the world right now, business is evolving, and there's going to be lots of people asked to do different roles inside organizations. So let's get into exploring a few of the hurdles we've got to overcome on that journey. So David, let's just get some examples and context. Can you give me some examples that you might have seen of skill sets changing through the evolution of a business?
Yeah, so I do a lot of work with startup companies from sort of seed through to Series A, Series B, that kind of trajectory. And what's amazing is that you see these sort of gigantic jumps in organizational development in a phenomenally short period of time. You should start off with, the seed round of say 3, 4, 5 people, get a bit more money, 10 people, 12 people, get to your Series A, 30, 40 people, and all that can happen within 2 years. So you'd have, exponential growth in terms of a sort of company and how quickly you're going. And that can lead to a whole series of problems in terms of capabilities. So, it's imagine like getting a lower league football team and a billionaire buys them and says, we want to win the Champions League. So should we go and buy Cristiano Ronaldo? I've got the money to do it. We can pay him whatever he wants, but he doesn't actually fit in the team. So you need to get capabilities to get you to the next level, to the next level, to the next level, to eventually get to the point where you can go, those are the kind of people that you bring in. And within that, you get some people that really kind of learn and accelerate and through that process. But there does become times when people they get to the end of their capability at that stage. And it might be an age thing or an experience thing. They've done really, really well to get to a pre-Series B, and then you're about to launch internationally and you don't have any experience, somebody doesn't have any experience of that, and you cannot afford for that not to work. You can't afford that to be a learning area for somebody, and just see what happens and take a punt. And so then you go out, get someone like yourself, Nick. You go, right, this is what I'm looking for. We need someone who's got experience in international markets, can build teams overseas, and you bring that person in. The tricky thing is what happens to the previous person that's been in that role that suddenly gets overlooked. And all businesses on that sort of fast growth curve have growing pains. So kind of like when we were teenagers, you grow really fast. Sometimes your knees and ankles, hurt just as you're going through that. And you see that a lot with businesses as well. And this is one of those kind of key growing pains. You have someone who's utterly brilliant, culturally a fantastic fit. They are loved by everybody in the business. They just got to a point where the role has got and the capability and the needs of that role for the sake of the business is just kind of outrun them. And that can be that leads to really painful conversations.
Yeah.
Because you've got guys been on that journey so long.
Yeah, and let's come back to explore a few of the solutions we have around that. What about you, Tom? What sort of context have you seen?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, Nick. I think the first thing I'd say, just to build on what we've already talked about, I think it's this question of whether or not we're trying to leash people or unleash people as leaders. I think historically a lot of leadership is based on command and control, when in fact genuine leadership is actually about freeing people up to enable them to perform at their best. And I think the other thing is people are talking a lot about culture, but I think it's got less to do with trying to fit people with the internal culture. I think it's got more to do with creating an acceptable culture in the first place. Now, I think the assumption is that somehow an organization's okay, rather like the organization that David just described. Is it okay? And I certainly find a lot of cultures are actually very difficult for people to operate in. So I think there are sort of 3 types of situations that I get involved in, which are a bit different to David. I think that the starting point as well, we talked about imposter syndrome, and I think the healthiest place to be still is to have that degree of humility. That said, that's even for experienced business owners. But I think in a startup, and I've done quite a lot of work, oddly enough, with startups. People don't know that don't know. They know actually even less. So in other words, they're looking at fairly looking at a pretty naive set of glasses, and they don't necessarily see round corners. They don't anticipate risk. They haven't necessarily had the breadth of experience to see the patterns of what does good look like and what does a problem look like, and and hence they have lots of unpleasant surprises which cost them a fortune. I think so I think there's a level of expertise which is quite difficult to train to develop, because what happens then, I think, with David, they just run out of steam, or they fall out with each other, or something happens and they just don't know how to resolve it. And very often the response to that is a exec just spending more time in the day, working late at night, all this sort of, and somehow they think startups are just unique. So, and I really don't think they are. I think I love entrepreneurialism, but I don't. And the second type of situation to provide, I think, is the sort of mature SME, particularly family SMEs, where, and David mentioned this about some of the family background, a lot of emotional baggage with families, very difficult to unravel. And I think in those situations, there are things around equity which are very difficult subjects to have in terms of building value. Families tend to hold on to the equity very tight, close to their chests. And there's a sort of very much a working for me type environment, which is a different type of situation. And the third one, which actually we've also worked with, is very large companies. And I think what happens with those organizations, they've just simply got far too many people. And they create what we talked about before, around these values, as if, again, the culture or the values are the things to fit into. But in fact, I think what happens there is you create a lot of people who are very, very fearful of actually speaking up. So it's absolutely leashing people to such an extraordinary degree. And, and then there's the challenge of how do you engage with startups? And it's sort of this oil and water type, situation. So I think there's a real need in those types of organizations to harness the energy of startups, when in fact actually that engagement, when you've got this sort of heavy cultural, values driven thing, actually where people are very fearful versus a immature startup, that it's very difficult to sort of join the dots there. And I think that's what I'd say in terms of the context of what we're going to talk about, or what I was planning to talk about a bit later.
Perfect. And David, coming back to your startup example, obviously the leader in that business would have seen someone evolve and coming up through the pace, and then there's been that huge sea change where they've just gone up to a level which is maybe beyond capabilities. That can be identified though, right? That can be something that could be roadmapped, and there are solutions to helping trying to bring those people through.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably one of the key things there is just so we don't miss that, is actually the CEO themselves. The founders are not impervious to this. 85% of founders are removed from their business or step down as CEO from their business when you hit 20 million turnover. So a lot of the time they do that because there's so much to do day to day that, as you said, Nick, you don't have that kind of conversations where you're thinking 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 steps down the road of people, even themselves, or their team around them, and how to develop them for not what you need now, but what you're building towards. And I think the best proactive people I know in businesses are the ones that are trying to look at people and go, well, you need to learn this not for now, but for down the line. And to do that, you've got to really trust your team to deliver on the now while you're spending time on things for the future that you don't need now. And you would have a lot of time as a leader to really think that through strategically and work that into a plan. That's kind of the A-star leaders that I work with do that kind of thing.
And Tom, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think David made some good points about looking towards the future. I think, if you've got a fast growth business, it takes time to implement and develop capability. You've got to be ahead of that. I think a lot of leaders actually aren't ahead of that, and you stumble into some very unpleasant surprises. And certainly from my experience of working with US fast growth startups from Silicon Valley, I was always looking 6 to 12 months ahead. And you need to have a solid team around you operationally to look after things as well. So, you can only do that if everything else is working. And we used to sign off $1 million inventory purchase orders every week, and a Sarbanes-Oxley environment. So really big risks. So you really need to have a good team around you. So I think that's the challenge. I think that said, though, when it comes to the leadership, the other challenge is leaders think it's always about somebody else. In terms of the culture, it's very rarely they look at themselves. But actually, I think it is vital to start off with the executive team themselves, because, put it simply, everybody behaves like the boss. And there's good reasons psychologically why people do that. And I think the question I first ask leaders is, what do they enjoy in their role and what don't they enjoy in their role? And that quite often you find they're in the wrong role in the first place, which is a bit of an interesting situation. And then you can get a better idea of actually what plays to their strengths. And sometimes you find a CEO in a marketing director's role, or a sales director doing a operations director's role, or something like that. So I think that's the first thing. I think the other thing is then to ask about the future, to identify who are the big thinkers and who are the narrow thinkers, and both are okay. Although I think at leadership, executive level, you do need to have broad thinkers. And I think a lot of exec tech leaders actually quite narrow in their thinking and look after the technology without necessarily looking after the broader picture. And I think the other thing is teamwork. Do people encourage teamwork, or is it all about them? That's quite critical. I look out for people who actually value what other people say. The other thing is, how do they engage with other people? If there's a challenge, how do they actually, and also have they got positive or negative action? So frankly, do they drink too much, or do they enjoy taking exercise during the day? So there are those sorts of things which matter. The other thing I think that's interesting is charisma as well. Charisma is thought to be a good thing, but actually it can be quite damaging, because it detracts quite heavily from the business. People can go out of their way to please some of these charismatic leaders, and certainly you can see that in a whole raft of tech startups, where the whole leadership words and the charismatic boss can actually hijack in all kinds of different situations. So I think the other thing is, in terms of the supporting team, the thing I do is to ask questions to establish capability, and then I give people things to do and see what happens in the first few days, and then from that, look for who's interested in helping each other, and then getting people together to check decision making. And decision making actually is a very difficult thing to evaluate. How do you know if somebody is good at making decisions, and whether or not they're sort of rounded decisions? That's very much, I think, around teamwork and the effectiveness of teams. So I think a lot of this actually can be done on the job. A lot of people talk about going off on training courses. I don't believe in that whatsoever. I think you can do this on the job. I think the challenge comes from the organization. The challenge is, how do you support people through this transition on the job? And I think what happens when you start getting this right, what the whole dynamic, I started in the first instance talking about, what does good look like? And I think what happens is that people begin to become quite, when they take their own actions, they begin to get more confident, and that's actually got its own dynamic. So the flip side of what I just originally said, which is around the control and fear and position type leadership versus proper leadership, the challenge is then when you've got people being themselves and being confident and developing grit, that's got a whole new dynamic, and that's the other challenge with leaders, I think, that they run into when this starts working well. And I think the other thing is, there are always people in organizations who just go along. I call them politicians, who say all the right things, but aren't necessarily the people who make things happen. And you can do exactly the same thing with those people by giving them the opportunity to do things in their own way. And actually you can bring them and make them more confident and more resilient in themselves. And what that does is it increases the integrity in the business. So rather than sort of abdicating responsibility, say, well, the boss said this, or this is what we're doing, or this is the values, actually they begin to find that themselves, and they begin to look after their own little bit of integrity themselves. So I think that's what I'd say, Nick, in terms of at the executive level and some of the sub levels in terms of key elements of capability.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the biggest challenges is the fact that leaders aren't setting out the future plans of the business to some of its teams and giving them an opportunity to realise the skills they're going to need. So if we take like a marketing team, for example, you're going to scale to be this beast, where budgets are going to triple, you've got to set that up to someone and give them an opportunity to see if they want to invest in their time to get to that level.
Yeah.
If not, they will understand what their flaws are, might be more accepting of having someone come in above them, rather than a sort of shock and frustration when they get into a conflict here. And another thing is, obviously people come to us all the time to sort of fill those skills gaps, and a lot of the times it's because they just haven't got a roadmap of how do we skill up these people, or they don't know how to test the people in their business to know if they're even capable of doing it. David, what have you seen around that? How have you seen people approach different ways of giving roadmaps to teams or actually testing skill sets?
Yeah, so one of the big problems is not having that conversation early enough. So exactly in that example you gave, if you've got a young person, they're 25, 26, you've got an 8-person startup company, you go, right, you're head of marketing because you're the only person in the company that does marketing. So by de facto, you are head of marketing, right? What people then don't do is they often have that painful conversation saying, look, this is the roadmap for the business. This is where we're going to be doing investment rounds or growth round, whatever it is. At this stage, we're going to need this. And it's going to be really, really hard for you to get to that point. The best people I know at that stage go, right, we've got 2 options. One, is this a company that you want to grow in? As we go from the sort of smaller, more intimate, I use the term family feel with Tom the other day, and he shot me down because he said he can't get rid of a family. But we all know that kind of small team environment that's very close-knit, your friends, your colleagues, it's all, and then companies sort of evolve into that performing team thing where teams don't necessarily put up the same things that the smaller units would. So I think it's having those conversations early enough and measuring expectations. So if you don't have that conversation, then when you go through your next big investment round and they see the organization chart and they see, chief marketing officer, they'll assume that that's them because they do that and there's nobody else to do it. So it's also having that potential awkward conversation, but actually that conversation can be incredibly powerful to the company, but also to the individual. Because some people don't necessarily want to transition up. Some people want to work in a company of 10 people where everyone's a mate and they'll go out for a beer on a Friday night. That's where they're at in their career. That's what they want. They enjoy sort of all the different parts of the business and being more involved. They don't necessarily want to have a marketing department of 10 desks in a different floor of a building. They like that part of a journey. So just be clear to have that 2-way dialogue where it works really, really well. And then also the expectations on the end of that. I had a client a few months ago now. So one of the problems in one of their sort of entry positions in the business, they said, we churn people every 2 years. It's a job that you do for 2 years. So we're trying really hard to get people to stay past 2 years. So I said, well, why would you do that? If there's no capability for them to move past that quickly enough, then why don't you just be honest and say, we see this as a 2-year role, at which point we'd hopefully promote you within the business to another role. Or how can we then prepare you for what you want to do next? What can you get from this role that will mean you can transition into a great next role?
David, I think that's some great points there. I think there's a lot of pressure on leaders at the moment to not lose staff. Like there's an obsession about retention rather than an understanding that it's a natural progression, and you've done really well to take certain people through into roles where it's time for them to progress on. And you should sort of celebrate that fact rather than sort of be worried about doing it. Most FDs, for example, I know, they have a part of the job they love. They love the turnaround, they love the growth story, they love the actual building infrastructure. And outside of that, they hate it. And especially sales. Like people hang on to sales individuals forever. And actually some of the best A players I know in the markets are gun for hires. They want to come in, they want 4 years of transforming your sales, kicking the crap out of the product, pushing it out to everyone they know, making a fortune, and then they want to leave. And a lot of businesses see that as a sign of, oh, we've lost our best sales guy, and try and retain them, rather than just accepting the fact they've probably squeezed as much juice as they feel they can out of a product. It's time to evolve the sales function around them, and it's just not done. And it just seems to be pure peer pressure to do that. Tom, what have you got to add to some of David's points there?
Yeah, and also just building on what you just said, Nick, I think it's very important for organisations to be clear about what they can offer, rather
Absolutely.
than the other way around. So I think I've been in situations where I've actually moved whole sites, and people have been leaving the business, but it's been very clear they've been leaving the business. But for that period of time, in terms of what the business could offer, you can do a lot to develop people and build their confidence, and frankly give them opportunities they've never had before. And it's just a remarkable experience. And I've had people who have actually been quite in their shells, who have actually come out of that type of process, who have actually started their own business and think, wow, I like that, or whatever they wanted to do. And I think that's about getting the best out of people and giving people the confidence, because a lot of organisations don't give people the confidence. I think the other thing is, in terms of leadership, is that certainly for me, I sort of fall into the category you just described of, I think leaders should be aware of what their strengths are and how long they should add value, because again, there's no saying how long they should be involved in this journey. That said, there's a challenge in terms of who should adjudicate that, because if the CEO clears off, who's actually then adjudicator? No, and there should be a chairman in these businesses as well to look after the shareholders and the governance. So I think the chair is important. I think that what I'd like to add is also, how do you test capability? And I think what I do is part of the winning thinking approach is to do this with the team all around them, their objectives, and I test them with new paradigms to see if they can take new action. And because if leaders can't take new action, then you've got to ask the question in terms of, can they actually steer the ship in the right direction? The other thing is, are they interested in others? And actually, have they got humility? We talked about this, and are they willing to take responsibility for their own actions? So I think there's when you start getting these things right, leaders become approachable and the communication becomes a lot healthier than it might be otherwise. And so by doing that, by fixing the relationships, by taking a new perspective, by testing if people can take new actions, what you create is what I describe as getting towards this jazz band situation, where it's a sort of improvisation as opposed to an orchestra, the conductor with their stick sort of banging the drum, which I think is definitely most particularly the sort of situations that David describes, very much sort of banging the drum, or either technically in quite a narrow sort of way, with the other people sort of picking up the pieces rather than working as a team. And it's almost like in some tech startups, it's almost trying to harness the boss, trying to steer them in the right direction very often. So I think, the challenge is also, how do you measure this? I mean, I like a capability roadmap, so with clear defined milestones to actually get from A to B. So you might start off with very little structure, very little organisation. You put the organisation, and then you develop the team, you put the reviews in place, and you effectively raise the bar all the time in a fairly tangible way. But you're very clear with people from the word go. And as long as you're clear with people, I think, even though they might not like what you're going to say, they will go along with it and they'll give you their full support. And I think that it's worth recognising what happens when you do this. It's a lot more energy. You've got a lot less control. So there's a real courage required to do this. It's more of a gentle steer, oddly enough, and an encouragement. And it's based upon capability, not position or fear or control. So I think, and this is when you get this right in terms of establishing. We do this in one day. It becomes very clear, actually, because sometimes subordinates can significantly outperform their bosses, which is an interesting challenge as well. So there's a question as to what level people are operating at the business. And then when you actually let this thing go and get it right, you then find out that some people actually haven't got the aptitude. And I think the sort of aptitude that's difficult to fix is whether or not people care about other people. A lot of owners think it's all about themselves, making themselves rich, and really find it very difficult to get past that. or they can't share the equity, or they can't find an equitable way to sort of share the wealth in the business, which just just starts to unravel. And I think the other side of this is also a lot of organisations need to do a lot of guerrilla hunting, so actually punch well above their weight. So the amount of professionalism an organisation, either a startup or the other way around, they need to be able to punch well above their weight in terms of professionalism, in terms of functionality, and that is always about having a team. It's all very well having a great CEO, but there's got to be a substantial team behind people. So I'd just like to make a couple of points about actually the reality here, Nick, as well. So I started off talking about some of the values and behaviours, and I'll just touch on a few points that I have come across, even with my independence I have in organisations, because I'm not tied actually to organisations' values or these other things. And so what I've found is that it's incredibly difficult to actually speak up. I talked about fear in large organisations, and I've had discussions even with HR directors where I've raised big issues around teams expected to be able to do things when in fact in really critical safety environments that they're not capable of doing with real risks. And I've raised this, and I've been told by HR directors to put up or shut up, right? And that's obviously a confidential discussion I had with the managing director, but this is the reality. And or when I've been running businesses, I've found that the leadership in the early stages will be very threatening to look after their own patch. So I might say something to one of the project managers, and their boss absolutely comes down on them like a ton of bricks, and this never actually comes to the surface. And I think this is the parallel dialogue we need to be aware of and actually acknowledge, because this is Jobsworth's situation, and I think that's the antithesis I'd like to suggest in terms of what can come through, and those are the people that I think need to be removed from organisations. And that I have no hesitation of when I find people are really badly bullying people like that, or they're not acknowledging serious issues, I think that's a very difficult point to get past, unless of course they can show the humility and say, look, I'm terribly sorry I got that all wrong. But sometimes this can be if that happens at executive level, you've got to ask the question around capability and motivation fundamentally.
Yeah, I think there's some great points there. Guys, thank you for today. We've had about 4 laptops die. My phone died. There's loads of hidden edits you have to look for, and you'll see when that happened. It is absolutely sweltering hot, so hot I'm not even wearing a gilet, which is a first for me ever. There's some great topics on there. I also think, just to sort of close out, when hiring for large organizations, these organizations know how to interview and know how to actually ask the questions around capabilities. And if you haven't been prepped, or you haven't understand how to answer those questions, you could be the most qualified person for a job, but you will not get the job due to the way large corporates are trained on how to interview. And it's something, if you find yourself stepping into one of those big first exec roles and you haven't had any coaching, or you don't know how to phrase it, you might be the best, but you will fall down on the presentation of your answers, which is sort of key, which sounds ludicrous in the world we operate and the best person should get the job. But it is a big presentation piece, and there is a certain way of being trained to answer these questions correctly. So just bear that in mind also if you're approaching a first sort of big exec role, or reach out to any of the crew here. We can talk you through a few of the ways and a few of the things you should be looking out to progress into senior positions there. Otherwise, thank you so much, everyone. We're all going to go get a large glass of water, maybe something stronger. We've got loads more topics coming up. Again, thank you to everyone for the feedback, for the comments, for the support on Twitter, Instagram, the LinkedIn channel. It's scaling and growing. We're loving the feedback. We're loving being challenged. So keep challenging us. This is meant to be a debate. This is not meant to be just the answers. So really enjoying it. Thanks to you all, and we will see you all hopefully in cooler climates very soon. All the best. Bye-bye.